The first Faltorian ship entered Earth's orbit without warning. A shimmering monolith, pulsing with alien energy, drifted silently through the void, its presence an eerie herald of something beyond human comprehension. It was unlike anything humanity had ever seen, a craft not designed for travel, but for domination. Humanity, for all its advancements, had never encountered such a being. The world held its breath as the Faltorians made their approach. Nations scrambled to respond, with military forces deployed, ready to confront what was believed to be an invading fleet. But the Faltorians made no aggressive moves. They arrived, but they did not fire. There were no demands, no threats. The Faltorians were calm, almost serene in their otherworldly presence. Their emissary, a being of translucent skin and shifting energy, communicated through strange symbols that became clear to all upon contact, a peaceful message, yet with an unmistakable command. Earth was to submit. A delegation of world leaders gathered, unsure of what to make of these extraterrestrial visitors. They were told Earth's future lay in their hands, that their arrival was not one of conquest, but of guardianship. The Faltorians offered peace, stability, and protection in exchange for humanity's surrender, total and unquestioning. There was no negotiation. Their technology was unmatched, their power overwhelming. They offered humanity a choice: join the Faltorian Imperium as a subject species or face annihilation. The world held its breath. What was humanity to do? For the first time in history, Earth united. Leaders put aside their differences, and a global vote was called. Debate raged for weeks, the fate of the planet hanging in the balance. Most saw the Faltorians as saviors, an opportunity to end the endless wars, famine, and suffering that had defined human history. But others, a minority of leaders and dissidents, saw only the grim reality beneath the veneer of peace: subjugation, control, the obliteration of human freedom. But the Faltorians were not to be denied. Their message was clear: submit or resist. In a moment of fear and confusion, humanity made its choice. And so, the Faltorians began their reign. The first signs of their control were subtle. Humans who once roamed freely across the earth found their movements restricted. Laws were implemented that seemed reasonable at first, global policies designed to reduce conflict and promote harmony. But then came the silent change. The Faltorians moved into Earth's most important cities, taking command of communications, military installations, and resource centers. Their presence was everywhere. The message was clear: this world was no longer solely humanity's to rule. A year passed, and under the surface, resistance began to brew. Small acts of defiance scattered the globe. The oppressed began to whisper that the Faltorians, for all their might, had underestimated humanity's tenacity. The spark of rebellion, long buried beneath the weight of Faltorian authority, was stirring. Yet, even as the first rebels formed secret groups, something darker began to stir within the Faltorians. What they had thought was humanity's submission, their perfect compliance, was merely the calm before the storm. They had underestimated the one thing that could not be controlled: human nature. The Faltorians had made a grave mistake. They had believed they could mold humanity into something docile, something submissive. But they did not understand what it meant to be human. They did not understand what it meant to fight, to survive, to push against the impossible. They had made humanity into their enemies, and humanity would show them just how dangerous they truly were. And so, from the shadows, the first acts of defiance rippled outward, unseen by the Faltorians. And from this, a movement was born, one that would change everything. To them, we were dangerous. But to us, they were the reason we became monsters. The Faltorians had underestimated the human spirit, but they had also underestimated the resilience of their resistance. At first, it had seemed like a fleeting rebellion, with pockets of humans gathering in secret to fight back against their alien overlords. But what began as an organized underground movement quickly transformed into something much more formidable. The first blows were small sabotages, hacking into Faltorian communication systems, assassinations of key officials. It was enough to get their attention, enough to make them realize that humanity had teeth. Then came the turning point. It started with a group of scientists, engineers, biologists, and geneticists who had once worked under the Faltorians, now coerced into collaboration by the Empire's demands. In secret, they began to reverse engineer Faltorian technology. They studied the advanced biomechanics, the enhanced weaponry, and the methods of genetic modification the Faltorians used on themselves. It was their desperation that led to the breakthrough. The project was called Genesis. At its core, it was an attempt to recreate the modifications that made the Faltorians so powerful, but with a crucial difference. The scientists sought not only physical augmentation, but mental and emotional empowerment. They wanted to make humans strong, yes, but they also wanted to preserve their humanity. What they did not foresee, however, was how deeply the augmentation would alter the very essence of those who underwent the transformation. The first test subjects were volunteers, resistance fighters who believed in the cause, who were willing to sacrifice everything. They became the first children of Earth. When the children awoke, it was as if a new breed of human had emerged. Their muscles were augmented beyond anything human biology had previously allowed. They could heal from wounds in days, not weeks. Their vision was enhanced, their reflexes faster than any soldier of the past. Their minds, while still human, were sharper, more focused. They could process information faster, calculate probabilities, and strategize with a terrifying efficiency. They were, for all intents and purposes, living weapons. But it was the emotional change that was the most profound. The children of Earth were no longer bound by the same moral and ethical constraints that had once defined humanity. They were capable of empathy, yes, but their empathy was now sharpened into something more dangerous, an understanding of what had to be done to ensure humanity's survival. They could be kind, but they could also be ruthless. And when pushed to the edge, they were capable of cruelty that even the Faltorians had not anticipated. The rebellion exploded into full-scale resistance. What had been small acts of sabotage turned into all-out war. The children of Earth led guerrilla strikes against Faltorian strongholds, their strength and precision making them nearly unstoppable. The Faltorians retaliated, of course, using their superior firepower to decimate human cities and entire regions. But they couldn't contain the growing tide of rebellion. The more they fought, the more the children of Earth seemed to multiply, spreading across the world like wildfire. However, it wasn't just the children who rose up. Ordinary humans, driven by the same desire for freedom and autonomy, picked up arms. They fought alongside the augmented soldiers, though not nearly as powerful or enhanced, yet fueled by the same rage and desire for liberation. Human ingenuity became the resistance's greatest weapon. While the Faltorians wielded their superior technology and might, the humans wielded their unyielding will to survive. Their tactics were often unorthodox, unpredictable, and maddening to the Faltorians, who had relied on the cold precision of their own tactics for centuries. Still, despite the victories of the resistance, the war was costly. Humanity's cities were reduced to rubble. The Faltorians' retaliations were swift and brutal, their ships firing down from orbit, burning entire regions with energy blasts. Civilian casualties mounted, and the resistance became more and more desperate. But as the rebellion spread, something else began to shift. The Faltorians, for all their technological superiority, began to show signs of uncertainty. Their perfect plans were crumbling. The children of Earth, once viewed as nothing more than expendable pawns, had evolved into a force that even the Faltorians could not easily subdue. And yet, the Faltorians were not without their own tricks. It was then that they introduced their greatest weapon, the Dominion. The Dominion were Faltorian super soldiers, far more advanced than anything humanity had created. They were engineered to be the ultimate warriors, immune to human weaknesses, enhanced beyond comprehension, and utterly loyal to their creators. They were designed to crush the rebellion once and for all. But there was one flaw in their design: they could not adapt. The Dominion were efficient, but rigid, driven by a code that made them predictable. And it was this flaw that the children of Earth were quick to exploit. The two forces, the Faltorians and the children, collided in bloody battles that tore the planet apart. Earth became a battleground, with each side fighting not just for control, but for the future of the human race. The children, driven by an anger and hatred born of their subjugation, were relentless, fighting to reclaim their planet. The Faltorians, in turn, fought to maintain control over a species they saw as nothing more than an experiment, a test case for their vision of a perfect empire. The war had only just begun, but in the hearts of those who fought, one question began to emerge. Were they truly fighting for freedom, or had they become monsters in the process? And so, the rebellion burned on, uncontrolled, untamed, and relentless. The war between humanity and the Faltorians had become an unrelenting storm, each battle leaving scars upon the land, the people, and the very soul of humanity. What had begun as a desperate rebellion for freedom was now an existential struggle, one that threatened to warp humanity into something unrecognizable. As the children of Earth continued to fight, something darker began to unfold. What had started as a biological enhancement to create super soldiers became a dangerous spiral. The Faltorian technology that was supposed to elevate humanity now began to warp it in ways no one had anticipated. The first signs of the transformation were subtle, little things, unnoticeable at first. The children of Earth, who had been given the gift of enhanced strength, agility, and intellect, began to lose their sense of empathy. The very emotions that made them human began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating ruthlessness. It wasn't a loss of humanity. It was a shift in how they defined it. They no longer saw themselves as human in the traditional sense. They were something more, something better. It wasn't just the children who changed. Ordinary soldiers, civilians who had taken up arms, felt the pull of the transformation as well. The augmentation had started to spread. An ever-growing group of people began to experience the effects of the technology. Their minds sharpened, their emotions dulled. And for some, the effects were far more extreme. There were whispers in the rebel ranks of soldiers who didn't feel the same anymore, of men and women who, after battle, no longer cared about the lives they took. Some felt the thrill of combat, others the numbness of their actions, as if nothing truly mattered anymore except victory. The idea of justice began to lose its meaning. What had once been a fight for liberation was now becoming a fight to dominate. The first to truly recognize the danger were the original leaders of the rebellion, those who had founded the resistance, who had fought for freedom. They saw what was happening, saw the way the children of Earth were evolving, and they were horrified. Captain Mara Dre, one of the most respected leaders of the rebellion, was the first to voice her concerns. She had been one of the first soldiers to undergo the genetic enhancements, the first to experience the effects of Faltorian technology. At first, the power had been intoxicating. The speed, the strength, the ability to think 10 steps ahead of her enemies. But as time passed, the exhilaration of power began to give way to a terrifying realization. She had become a monster. Her heart, once driven by the need to protect humanity, now beat with a cold rhythm of war. She found herself leading her soldiers with military precision, no longer questioning the cost of their victories. She had started making decisions she would never have considered before, killing civilians who were caught in the crossfire, using extreme methods of interrogation to gain information. These were not the actions of a savior. They were the actions of someone who had lost their soul. Mara's realization came one night, in the aftermath of a brutal battle for a city on the outskirts of what was once New York. Her team had wiped out a Faltorian outpost, but in the process, countless civilians had been caught in the crossfire. She had known the casualties were high, but it wasn't until she stood in the ruins of the city that the enormity of her actions hit her. Her soldiers, the very children she had helped to create, moved through the wreckage with grim efficiency, their faces cold, their eyes empty. She stood alone among the ruins, the echoes of the past calling to her. What had they become? The Faltorians had started this war, yes, but it was they, the children of Earth, who were now perpetuating it. They were now just as ruthless, just as calculating. In fighting to protect their world, they had lost the very essence of what made them human. It was then that Mara made a decision that would change everything. She knew that the rebellion couldn't continue down this path, not if humanity wanted to survive with its soul intact. But how could she stop it? How could she stop a war that had become its own unstoppable force, a machine running on anger, fear, and thirst for revenge? There was no easy answer. The children of Earth were no longer just soldiers. They were leaders, generals, political figures, and they commanded armies of their own. The influence of a Faltorian technology had spread too far. There were some who embraced it completely, and others who saw themselves as the rightful rulers of a galaxy that had been handed to them. These were no longer the soldiers of freedom. They were conquerors, the very monsters humanity had once feared. And yet, despite the cold, calculating nature of their new form, a fragment of humanity still remained in the children of Earth. There were still those who questioned what they had become, those who clung to the idea of liberation, not domination. But these voices grew quieter with each passing day, drowned out by the relentless march toward victory at any cost. And then, as if to confirm humanity's fears, the Faltorians made their move. They knew they could no longer defeat humanity with sheer force alone. They had created monsters, and they would need something more to stop them. But as the war continued to spiral, one question began to haunt every rebel. Had the Faltorians made a mistake by creating the children of Earth, or had humanity simply become the very thing they feared? Was their victory truly theirs, or had they lost everything that made them human in the process? In the end, the children of Earth had become the mirror image of their enemies, an unstoppable force marching toward a future that was both terrifying and inevitable. The final days of the war against the Faltorians were a blur of bloodshed and fire. Humanity had won. The Faltorians, who had once ruled the stars, had been driven from Earth. Their empire lay in ruin, their fleets scattered across the galaxy, fleeing from the wrath of the children of Earth. But in the wake of their victory, the cost became clear, a price far greater than anyone could have anticipated. Earth was a shell of what it had once been. The cities, once vibrant and full of life, were now charred remains. The sky above, once blue and clear, had become a muted, ashen gray. The oceans were polluted, and the very soil had been scarred by years of warfare. The world had been remade in the crucible of battle, and the scars were not just physical, they were spiritual. The children of Earth, who had led the rebellion, now stood as the undisputed rulers of the planet. But they were not the saviors they had once hoped to be. They had been forged in the fires of war, and as they stood victorious, they found themselves at the mercy of their own creations. The power they had gained from the Faltorian technology had changed them in ways they could never have imagined. What was once a passionate, rebellious human spirit had been twisted into something cold and calculated. The children had become masters of the world, but in doing so, they had lost the very essence of humanity that had once driven them to resist the Faltorians. The lines between freedom fighters and tyrants blurred, and the victory that had seemed so sweet now tasted like ash. Among the leaders of the children, Mara Dre felt this loss most acutely. She stood before a council of her fellow warriors, their faces stern and unmoving. They had just signed a new decree, formalizing their control over the planet, an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. Earth would be rebuilt, they promised, but it would be rebuilt on their terms. Any dissent would be met with swift and brutal retribution. Mara had never imagined this moment, this victory, would come at such a steep price. She had fought for freedom, for the right of humans to determine their own fate. But now, as she looked at the faces around the table, she realized that in defeating the Faltorians, they had simply become the next conquerors, the next oppressors. It was a bitter truth, one she couldn't escape. But Mara was not alone in her despair. There were others who felt the same way, those who had once fought by her side, now haunted by the actions they had taken. Some, like Mara, had begun to question the path they had chosen. But for every voice of dissent, there were many more who saw their new power as a gift, a means to ensure the survival of the human race. They had the technology of the Faltorians at their fingertips, and with it, they could reshape the world in their image. The first signs of division appeared in the aftermath of the war. Those who had once been united in their goal of liberation now found themselves at odds over how Earth should be ruled. Some sought peace, rebuilding what was left of humanity, while others, more radical, more ruthless, believed that only through domination could Earth be secured. These factions began to clash, as the children's leadership fractured into warring ideologies. The seeds of a new conflict were sown, one that threatened to tear the very fabric of humanity apart. For every new city that was built, there was another that was burned to the ground. For every act of kindness, there was an act of cruelty. The children of Earth, once saviors, now rulers, found themselves locked in a vicious cycle. The more they sought to control, the more they became like the very Faltorians they had once fought against. And as the years passed, a new generation began to rise. They had not known the world before the war, before the Faltorians had arrived. They had only known the struggle, the hardship, and the reign of the children. To them, the old heroes, those who had led the rebellion, were nothing more than legends, stories of a time when humanity had fought for something greater than power. The new generation looked at the world with different eyes that saw only the cold, unforgiving order the children had imposed. The sense of hope that had once burned so brightly now flickered like a dying flame. The leaders of the rebellion had won, but at what cost? Humanity had been saved, yes, but it had been transformed, twisted into something darker, more brutal. The question that haunted them all now was simple. Had the children of Earth truly won? And as the planet continued to rebuild, whispers began to spread. A new enemy was rising, one that would challenge the children not with brute force, but with an idea, a philosophy that would tear at the very heart of their empire. The Faltorians may have been defeated, but their legacy had planted the seeds of a new rebellion, one that would not fight with weapons, but with ideals. Humanity had become what it had once feared, an empire, ruled by the very monsters they had created. The cost of victory had been steep, and as Mara Dre looked out over the war-torn world, she wondered if they had truly saved Earth, or if they had condemned it. The children of Earth had won the war, but they had lost their souls in the process. In the years that followed the defeat of the Faltorians, Earth became a fractured world. The children of Earth, once hailed as the saviors of humanity, now stood as rulers, overseeing a divided planet. Their victory had come at an immense cost, and the scars of war ran deep within the people they sought to protect. In the aftermath, a strange, unsettling quiet had settled over the world. Earth was rebuilt, its cities rising from the ashes like a new dawn, but something had gone terribly wrong. The children, no longer the idealistic rebels they once were, had become the new oppressors. Their actions, once driven by a desire for freedom, had become driven by an insatiable need for control. They imposed strict laws to maintain order, crushed dissent with ruthless efficiency, and had come to rule with an iron fist. There were whispers in the shadows, however, of a growing resistance, one that no longer sought to overthrow the Faltorians, but to reclaim the very essence of humanity. Among the disillusioned, there was one name that became a symbol of hope: Lien Kova. Lien had been a soldier in the original rebellion, a fierce fighter who had fought alongside Mara Dre and the others. But unlike most of the children, Lien had not undergone the full augmentation. She had remained human, resisting the allure of the enhancements that had turned her comrades into superhumans. It was not out of fear or weakness, but a deep, unshakable belief that humanity could not be allowed to lose itself in the pursuit of power. She had watched in horror as her fellow soldiers, once noble, once full of heart, became more and more like the very monsters they had fought against. For years, Lien had kept her head down, hiding from the new regime, watching as the world she had fought for began to crumble. But when she heard the first rumors of a new uprising, an underground movement bent on returning humanity to its roots, she knew she could no longer stay silent. The time had come to fight again, but this time, The enemy was not the Faltorians. It was the children of Earth themselves. Lien's resistance grew quickly, fueled by those who still remembered what it was like to be free. They were humans who had not yet been augmented, ordinary people who longed for a return to a world where choice and compassion had meaning. Lien's movement, called the New Dawn, spread like wildfire through the underground networks. Their goal was simple: to tear down the children's empire and restore the heart of humanity. But their challenge was formidable. The children of Earth were no longer just soldiers. They were leaders, political figures, and powerful commanders who had carved out their own empire. The New Dawn's message resonated with many, but to many, it seemed like a fool's hope. The augmented children were everywhere, monitoring communications, enforcing the law with deadly force. Any sign of rebellion was swiftly crushed. Still, the New Dawn persisted. They operated in the shadows, performing covert strikes on children's facilities, sabotaging supply chains, and freeing those who had been imprisoned by the children's regime. It was a war fought in whispers and half-formed plans, but it was a war with a purpose, a war to reclaim the soul of humanity. In one of the hidden bunkers beneath the ruins of an ancient city, Lien gathered her closest allies. They had been planning for weeks, preparing to strike a blow that would send shockwaves through the children's empire. A top-ranking officer, someone close to the ruling council, had defected, bringing with him critical information. The children's leadership, though strong, had grown complacent. They had not expected another challenge, not so soon. Lien's plan was risky. It involved infiltrating the children's central command, taking down their leaders, and broadcasting a message to the entire world. The message would be simple but powerful. Humanity is not the children of Earth. Humanity is something more. It would be a declaration of defiance, a call for the people of Earth to remember their true nature, to reclaim their freedom and their humanity. But the children of Earth had become something far more dangerous than they ever were before. The augmented children were now not just soldiers, they were gods among men, their strength and intellect far beyond what human biology had ever allowed. The New Dawn knew they could never defeat them in open combat. They would have to strike at their hearts. The night of mission, Lien stood in front of a gathering of her soldiers. Most of them were young, some barely old enough to remember the days before the war, before the Faltorians had come. They were not fighters by nature, but they were driven by something stronger, a belief that humanity could still be saved from the darkness that had taken root. Tonight, we remind them of who we really are, Lien said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. We remind them that no matter how much they've changed us, they cannot take our hearts. This is not about power. This is about freedom. This is about humanity. Her words were a spark in the dry tinder of their souls. Her followers were ready. The infiltration was swift, methodical. They struck under the cover of darkness, slipping through the cracks of the children's fortified defenses. The plan had been set in motion, and each soldier played their part, taking out key figures, disrupting the children's command, and planting the broadcast device that would send Lien's message to the farthest reaches of the world. As the countdown began, Lien stood in the heart of the children's control center, surrounded by the remains of the empire they had built. Her heart raced. This was the moment. And then, as the device activated, she saw it, the face of Mara Dre, appearing on every screen across the globe. For the first time in years, the voice of the children spoke not of dominance, but of a warning. The time has come to choose humanity. Mara's voice rang out, her expression weary, almost regretful. We have fought the Faltorians, but in doing so, we have become them. We have built an empire of power, not freedom. I have seen what we have become, and I cannot let it continue. It is time to remember who we are. The broadcast ended, and silence fell. The children of Earth, their empire shaken by the truth of their actions, now faced an uncertain future. Would they listen? Would they fall back into the path of destruction they had once promised to fight? And would humanity, at long last, reclaim its soul? In that silence, the world held its breath. For the first time in years, there was hope. The rebirth of humanity had begun. The days that followed the broadcast were nothing short of chaotic. The message from Mara Dre, a message of regret, of confession, shattered the carefully constructed image of the children of Earth as the saviors of humanity. For years, the children had ruled with an iron grip, believing that their power was necessary to rebuild the world and preserve humanity's future. But now, that same power was in question. The very foundation of their empire had been shaken, and the people of Earth, who had long suffered under their rule, found themselves questioning the reality they had been forced to accept. Lien Kova and the New Dawn watched from the shadows as the world reacted. They had prepared for this moment, hoping, praying that Mara's words would be enough to spark a revolution. The rebellion was no longer an underground movement. It had become a movement of the people. Across the globe, protests erupted in the streets. The children of Earth, those who had once been revered as heroes, were now seen as the tyrants they had become. Old alliances fractured, and new ones formed as former rebels and ordinary civilians rallied together in defiance. Yet, the children of Earth were not so easily toppled. The augmented warriors, who had once fought side by side with Mara Dre, now stood in opposition to her message. They believed in their vision of humanity, one where strength was the only currency, where survival meant control. They had lost all sense of what it meant to be human. To them, Mara's broadcast was an act of betrayal, a weakness they could not afford. The children's high command convened in secret, including the most powerful figures, those who had been altered beyond recognition by Faltorian technology. They could no longer be considered human in the traditional sense. They were enhanced, augmented, and far beyond the ordinary abilities of the remaining humans. But despite their superior strength and intellect, even they were not prepared for the wrath of the people. The revolt began in earnest, as Lien and her allies led coordinated strikes against key children strongholds. The revolutionaries, emboldened by Mara's words, fought with the fervor of those who had nothing left to lose. Yet, the children of Earth were no strangers to war. Their tactical brilliance, honed in the blood-soaked fields of the rebellion, was unmatched. But now, they found themselves fighting not an enemy they could simply crush, but an entire world united against them. In the midst of the chaos, Mara disappeared. No one knew whether she had been taken by the children who had once stood by her, or if she had chosen to vanish into the wilderness, seeking redemption or simply running from the consequences of her actions. But her absence did little to slow the tide of rebellion. Her voice had done its job, awakened the people to the truth of what the children had become. The war that followed was unlike anything the world had seen. It was no longer a conflict between two armies. It was a war for the very soul of humanity. The children of Earth, with their unmatched power, sought to maintain their rule, but the rebellion was not one they could easily defeat. The more they fought, the more they saw the faces of the people they had once sworn to protect. The revolutionaries were not faceless soldiers. They were mothers, fathers, children, and farmers. They were the heartbeat of the world they had fought to rebuild. And as the war raged on, something remarkable happened. The augmented warriors of the children began to falter. The power they had taken for granted, their strength, their speed, their intellect, no longer seemed so infallible. The more they fought, the more they realized the thing they had lost in their transformation, their connection to the people. The humans, those who had not been altered by Faltorian science, were not weaker for it. They had something the augmented children no longer had: empathy. The very thing the children had cast aside in their pursuit of perfection became their undoing. While the children fought with logic and precision, the rebels fought with something far more dangerous: passion. In the final clash for control of Earth, Lien Kova stood before the children's central command, the last bastion of their reign. Her heart was heavy, for she had once been one of them, one of the children. And now, here she was, leading the charge against the very empire they had built. She had fought alongside these warriors, trusted them. But they were no longer the people she had known. They had become something else, something monstrous. As the battle unfolded, Lien found herself face to face with a familiar figure: Nolan, one of the first to undergo the augmentation process. Once he had been a comrade, a friend. Now, his eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth that had once defined him. He had become everything they had fought against. He was the embodiment of the empire the children had built. "You can't win, Lien," Nolan said, his voice a low growl, a reflection of the monstrous power that flowed through him. "We've already won. You cannot defeat what we've become." Lien looked at him, her heart heavy with sorrow. "I'm not fighting to defeat you, Nolan," she said, her voice steady. "I'm fighting for humanity, for the people who still believe we can be better. You're not who you were anymore, but we can still remember what we once stood for." In that moment, something in Nolan's eyes flickered, a flash of the person he had been long ago. But the power that coursed through his veins, the Faltorian enhancements that had rewritten his very being, pushed that flicker aside. He lunged at her, but this time, Lien was ready. The battle was fierce, but in the end, it wasn't the children's might that won. It was the will of the people. The resistance flooded the command center, and Nolan was brought down not by the strength of a single warrior, but by the collective determination of those who had fought for something greater than power. As the final stronghold of the children fell, the world held its breath. Humanity had won, but at a great cost. The children of Earth were no longer rulers. The people once again had their chance to rebuild, this time with the lessons of the past etched into their hearts. Lien stood amidst the ruins, looking out over a world that had been ravaged but was still alive. The road ahead would be long, but there was hope now. Humanity had reclaimed its soul, not by defeating the children of Earth, but by remembering what it meant to be human. The reckoning had come, but from its ashes, a new dawn was born. And in that dawn, humanity would rise again. This time, not as monsters, but as something more, something better. Something truly human.